50 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. would have been 38 years old. Next year, I will be 38 years old. By his 38th birthday, Martin Luther King had written 2 books. He had marched on Washington and delivered the I Have a Dream speech. He boycotted and desegregated the buses on Montgomery, Alabama. He marched on Selma, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize. So needless to say, 2017 is going to be a very busy year for me. 50 years ago, people that looked like me lived in terror. The kind of terror that we ascribe to other countries like Syria and Turkey, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They were bombed and beaten and bruised. They were lynched and murdered without the protection of the law, and sometimes even with the complicity of the law. They were segregated, they were estranged, they were hated, all because of the color of their skin and the zip code that they lived in, because of an unreconciled history of our people. That was the energy that spurned the civil rights movement. And while I am elated by the spirit of today and by celebrating Dr. King last week and Black History Month next month, I'd be doing a disservice to the movement not to pause and reflect on how far we still have to go and how much it's going to take for us to get there. Right now, we're having one of the worst civil rights violations in our history. And we don't talk about it with each other. And if we do, we talk about it in our own circles, in hushed tones, perhaps because we're ashamed that it's happening on our watch. Sure, we read the books, and we'll watch the documentaries, and we might even put something online about it, but when the pages are shut and the screens are dark and the Twitter feed is rolled over, the conversation ends. We need to have that conversation every single day. We talk about criminal justice reform as if it's linear and acute. We just say, well, some people are working on it, and I do my part, and everything's going to be okay if we re-examine some laws and take some people out of prison and protest about the police. But I hate to tell you that it's going to take a lot more than celebrating a day or a month. It's going to take a lot more than a protest or a march. It's going to take a lot more than just those few people working on it to move the needle on this issue. I'm talking, of course, about mass incarceration. In the land of the free and the home of the brave, we represent 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its incarcerated population. 2.2 million of our neighbors are in jails and prisons right now, with another 7 million people on probation and parole, one misstep away from getting locked up. 70% of people coming out of our jails and prisons recidivate within a few years. 1 out of 4 Americans has a criminal record. 1 out of 3 every Black man born today will end up in prison at some point in their lifetime. Despite making up 14% of the national population, African Americans represent almost 50% of the incarcerated population. Indeed, there are more African American men under correctional control now than there were slaves on the eve of the Civil War. These are problems that are going on in our justice system, and it continues to operate in the same way, without innovation, without creativity, with the same result. And it's because we don't have the tough conversations. It's time for a new civil rights movement. This isn't new news to the Black community. We've known this for a long time. We've been saying it for decades, and we blame inertia for something not happening. We blame the lack of leadership for something not happening. We're waiting for our next Martin. We're waiting for our next Malcolm. We're waiting for our next Rosa Parks. We're waiting for someone, anyone, to take us to the promised land. You know what I say? Stop waiting. The leaders of the new civil rights movement are sitting in this room. Take a look around. Go ahead. Take a look around. I'm not talking about that next Martin Luther King who's going to get that great speech. I'm not talking about the Rosa Parks who's going to sit in that bus at the risk of personal safety. I'm not talking about Malcolm X who's marching through the streets with his hands up. I'm talking about each and every one of you. You all came in here today with the ability to be the new leader of the civil rights movement. Before we get there, though, I want to kind of see what kind of leaders we have in this room and how many of you are keyed into the issues. How many of you have been convicted of a crime and gone to jail or prison? Look around. How many of you have a family member or a friend who's been convicted of a crime or is in prison? A few more. How many of you are appalled at the numbers and at the functioning of our criminal justice system today? How many of you would like to do something but you don't know what? Good. Because each one of you can do something. We think about the civil rights movement, we think about these big marches, these big speeches, these big protests, but the civil rights movement was so much more than that. It was young children leaving their schools and flooding the jails in Birmingham, Alabama. It was the death of 4 young girls in Birmingham in a church. It was the death of 1 young boy in a swamp bed in Mississippi that everybody saw on the news. It was the people who went and volunteered with the Freedom Riders and marched in those streets. It was the teachers, it was the students, it was the people sitting at home watching the news, picking up the phone, calling their local official, having conversations in schools and in churches and in homes. It was people who didn't have the right to vote, having people who had the privilege to do so come and represent them in a way that gave them the power. That's what the civil rights movement was about, and that's why you were all equipped. When I was 19 years old, I remember standing in front of a police officer, handing him money and drugs and drug paraphernalia, thinking in my mind that my life was about to end. Why? Not because I knew anything about the criminal justice system, but I knew that I might get grounded. I knew that my car might get taken away. I knew that I might not be able to go back to school, but I was standing there thinking, God, my life is over. I had no idea how close I was to the edge. I didn't know that if I had been convicted of that crime, I would have been a convicted felon. I would have lost the ability to go to college the next year, and probably the year after that, and probably the year after that. I didn't know that if I lived in another zip code and I was a convicted drug felon, I would have lost my opportunity at public housing, forcing me out on the street. I didn't know that I would have gone on probation and had a 75% likelihood of violating within the first 6 months, and that violation would have ended me up in at least the House of Correction, if not state prison. And then coming out of that House of Correction or state prison, I would have been in an environment that would require me to either go back to drug dealing or something worse. And then something worse usually meant physical violence against another person by stealing something. And from there, the cycle continued and continued and continued until I was in state prison for the rest of my life on your dollar. I had no idea that that was going to happen, but I knew something so bad was going to happen. I was standing on the edge of my life, and then it did it. I was allowed to go back to college. I was allowed to go to law school. I graduated from law school with honors. I went on to get one of the most prestigious jobs in the country as an assistant district attorney in the Suffolk County District Attorneys in Boston. I had a highly decorated career, and within the last year, I've sat with celebrities, with athletes, with musicians, with secretaries of state, and with the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama, advising him on the criminal justice reform bill. How did that happen? Because that police officer that had stopped me in my living room. That police officer that had stopped me was white. That police officer that stopped me was my father. And because my father and my mother were the most wonderful people and they adopted brown children, I was protected with the shield of white privilege. And that privilege is what protected me from the depths of the criminal justice system, just by growing up in a different zip code and just by having parents that didn't see me the way that the rest of the world did. Because if I had grown up in another place, in another zip code, I would have fallen down that rabbit hole because of the shield I had of that privilege, which most of the people in this room carry with you every single day. I'm here before you. That's why you were in a position to be the new civil rights leaders of our time. Because in my career, I've had the opportunity to meet lots of men like me. In fact, a young man named David, when I met him, he was 19 years old. He lived in one of the worst projects in Boston. He lived there with his 3 older brothers and his mother. And he was nearly homeless. And to put money and food on the table, he was out selling drugs. And when he got caught, he got probation. He got arrested. Then he got probation. Then he violated. Then he came out. He joined a gang. The gang robbed and stole and did bad things to people. But he was doing it not because he was a bad person, but because he'd missed out on all of these opportunities just because of where he lived. And he continued to do bad things. He continued to go to prison. He continued to come out and still be in this gang. And then one day when he was 26 years old, David died on the sidewalk. David was one of the brightest young men that I knew. 2 weeks ago, I was in Angola prison, one of the worst prisons in our country in Louisiana. And there I met 50 men, all serving life without parole sentences for crimes they had committed before the age of 17. I met a man who's been in prison for stealing a purse from a woman by gunpoint. And I don't want to diminish his crime or the feeling that the victim had in that case, but when I was speaking to this man, he was telling me about how he lost his 5 brothers while he was in prison, while he lost his 3 sisters while he was in prison, while he lost his father while he was in prison, and that he was up for parole next month, but he didn't think he was going to get it. He was 53 years old. Not because he was a bad person, not because he was a violent, evil person, but because he didn't have the privilege that I had. So what are we going to do? I became a prosecutor because I realized I could use the privilege that I got not only as a shield to myself and to the others around me, but as a sword to fight the people that were trying to take it away from these folks. You can do that. And you don't even need to go to law school. Let me tell you how. Science tells us that when a baby's in utero and the mother is suffering from any type of trauma or stress, including homelessness, or just not being able to get a job, or not being able to take care of her nutritionally, that child has a very strong likelihood of ending up in the criminal justice system. From the ages of 0 to 3, 75% of the people in jail have had at least 3 interactions with the child welfare system. 75% of the people sitting in jail right now, when they were infants, were telling us when they're in the child welfare system, I'm going to go to prison unless you do something right now. Come take care of me, come read to me, come hold me, do something. And then those kids go into elementary school. By the time they reach the 1st grade, kids in the inner city have heard 30 million less words than kids in the suburbs. Kids in the inner city have been read to, on average, 24 hours from the time they're 0 until the time they're 6. Kids in the suburb, that number is 1,800. That gap in literacy, that gap in having someone sit there and read with you, to share words with you, talk to you, show you some attention and love, that disparity directly correlates in trajectory into the criminal justice system. And by the time they reach middle school, having lost the opportunity to learn how to read, these kids don't have the opportunity to learn from reading. In middle school, we're not smart enough, we're not developed enough to say, Mister, I'm having a problem understanding. I didn't learn how to read, so I can't learn from reading. Please help me. That's not what we do when we're in middle school. What do? We act up. We throw things. We're the class clown. Or we sit in the back and we fall asleep. Those kids, because they're failing in school at that age, have a direct path in the criminal justice system. And what do we do as adults? We punish them. We suspend them. We expel them. And by the time that's happened 2 or 3 or 4 times, they're so disengaged in school, by the time they get to high school, they have the opportunity to drop out, and we wonder, why do you not want to come back to this place? What do? They seek out other young men and women like them, because those young men and women will love them and give them loyalty and respect. When I was in high school and I searched that out, when I was looking for those young men that I loved and I would do anything for, and we'd go out on Friday nights and we'd commit violence against groups of other men, we called that a football team. But in the inner city, that's called a gang, not because of the violent, inherent nature of these kids, but because of the resource, the zip code, and the color of their skin. And then those gangs get shook down, they're more arrested, they're more prosecuted, they're more detained. And finally, when they commit that bad act, we sit there and we point our fingers at them and we punish them for their failure. You screwed up. We absolve ourselves of all the failures that we made as adults along the way. By simply not having a conversation. By simply not taking the time to volunteer to do something, anything, that each of you can do as the new civil rights leaders. 50 years from now, we're going to look back on this period of time, much like we sit here and look back 50 years. We're going to look back and say, you had 2.2 million people in jail? You had the government killing people? 50% of your population in jail only represented 14% of the population, and you just stood by. 50 years from now, they're going to be saying that, and you'll have one choice in it. How do you want to be remembered? Because as Dr. King said, in the future, we will not remember the words of our enemies. We'll remember the silence of our friends. So in 50 years from now, it's up to you. Do you want to be remembered as the person who stood silent? Apparently, yes. I'm going to ask you again. 50 years from now, when we look back on this period of our time, and this period in our history, do you want to be remembered as someone who remained silent? No. Do you want to be remembered as someone who took the time to take a pregnant mother and ask her if she needed something? Do you want to be someone that took the time to take a kid and go to an elementary school in the morning instead of maybe the yoga class and read to a child for 30 minutes? Do you want to be the one that can volunteer after school with kids who are having trouble learning from reading? Do you want to be the one that takes the time to volunteer in an after-school program? Do you want to be the one that takes the time just to have a conversation with a neighbor that might disagree with you? Just to have a conversation with a neighbor that you might not look like. Just to invite someone into your neighborhood, or even better, go into theirs and try to find out and understand something about their life so that you can use your sword, you can use your shield, you can use your privilege to give them the opportunity to be in this room and not locked up in prison. Do you want to do that? Yes. So who is going to? In 50 years from now, you'll be able to be remembered as someone who remained silent, and someone who is a leader in the new civil rights movement. I encourage you, I beg you, I plead you to join me, join everyone else that has been committed, and stand there in 50 years or lay there and be remembered as someone who didn't remain silent, as someone who did something. Thank you. Let's get to work.